morning's talk, I don't normally have a specific title for every class, but this morning's is entitled Solomon and Egypt. I'm trying to get past Solomon in our history of biblical economics. It's not that easy. This is our 12th lecture, by the way, spread over 2 years. Last week, I spoke about the Fertile Crescent. And I'm counting on everybody's ability to think Fertile Crescent, more or less where it is. Chris Ann, for heaven's sakes, I hear that you joined the church several weeks ago. I'm so glad, darling. Welcome. Delighted to have you in the church. Nancy was sharing that with me. The Fertile Crescent, in the second millennium before Christ, had three major powers, almost from outside the Fertile Crescent, who tended to be dominant within it. The earliest of these is the old Babylonian Empire. Now, the old Babylonian Empire goes back a lot further than 2000 BC, but the part of the old Babylonian Empire that I'm concerned with is the later period, which is generally said to date between 1894 and 1595. Let's say pretty much the bulk of the first half of the second millennium before Christ. The most famous of the emperors from the old Babylonian Empire, which of course the old Babylonian Empire is in the extreme southeast of the Fertile Crescent. The most famous of those emperors was a man by the name of Hammurabi. Yeah. And he's famous for Hammurabi's Code. Now, the period of Hammurabi is 1782 to 1750. As far as we can discern, it was during Hammurabi's reign that Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees. Of course, it was Ur, but it wasn't Chaldees in those days. The Chaldees would not arrive for several centuries more. But he left Ur of the Chaldees and went up north to Haran, and then continued southwest all the way down into Egypt. And that's all recorded, of course, in Genesis 11 and 12. Back when I was a young student in my teens, a teacher I had said an easy way of remembering when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees. He left Ur of the Chaldees in the same year that Paul Revere left Boston, 1775, and hardly a man is now alive who remembers the famous day and year. Somehow I'm not seeing all those looks of recognition. Okay. Anyway, in my time, by the time you were age 5, you recited the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere by heart. But I have the feeling maybe today's younger people may not know poetry as well as us old timers learned it. But of course, it's 1775 BC. BC. Okay. Try to remember it that way. I found that very helpful. And the fact that 70 years later I'm sharing it with you says it did stick. The other empire is the Hittite Empire. Now the Hittites are not even part of the Fertile Crescent. Hittites dominated up in the Anatolian Peninsula, the region we now call Turkey. But this long, it's millennia before the Turk ever gets there. The Hittite Empire, now you have a map for that. Those two maps you have there together, look at the second of those maps, which is the Egyptian map. But right above the Egyptian Empire, you'll see their Hittite Empire. Okay. That little area right up there called Hittite Empire, that corresponds to your first map. The line around on my computer it was a green line. It didn't come out green here. But you'll notice that region, the Hittite Empire, extends down south right into the Levant. It's not limited to the Cappadocian Peninsula. It includes what would become Phoenicia. In fact, as far south as Damascus. The Hittite Empire, and I put down the two major kings at the very end of the Hittite Empire. That period between 1350 and 1295, that corresponds to the period of the Israelite conquest after the Exodus. Roughly, starting with Subilamia, beginning in 1350, and ending with Marcella II in 1295, that corresponds to the period of the Israelite conquest. I don't know why, but when I was a young man, the Hittites just appealed to me. I just don't know why. And I was always reading about the Hittites. And my classmates made fun of me. Okay. And they hurt my feelings. And you can see how sensitive I still am on that. My feelings are still frayed because they made fun of me and said, "He's a Hittite." Now the Hittites have no rule at the time, in the biblical times we're dealing with. But there's still lots of Hittites in the Holy Land. Even one of David's generals is a Hittite. Uriah. General Uriah. We won't go into that this morning. The one I really want to deal with, though, is the Egyptian Empire, which is by far the longest lasting. The Egyptian Empire, at its greatest extent, Amenhotep III, the 9th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, you have on that map there, the dark section of the map. Notice that Egypt extends way up to right under the Hittite Empire. Got that? The power vacuum that was left by the downfall of the decline of the Hittites was taken over by Egypt. And you notice the Egyptian territory has this thumb that extends way up, and that includes the Holy Land. Egypt was certainly controlling the Levant well into the 14th century. This particular pharaoh, we've got lots of documentation on him. He ruled from June of 1388 to December of either 1351 or 1350. We've got far more specific. Now today, I want to study Solomon's relationship to Egypt. It begins with the reign of Shusendes II, who was pharaoh from 967 to 943. 967 to 943. He is the last pharaoh of the 21st dynasty. He was the pharaoh when Solomon assumed the throne of Israel in 961. Now, the 21st Egyptian dynasty was a weak, declining dynasty and would very soon be replaced. But it was precisely that Egypt was in decline that accounts for Saul's and David's and Solomon's ability to create a little empire of their own. If you think back to the map I gave you last week, the map of the Holy Land and the full extent of Solomon's kingdom, going all the way from the western extension of the Euphrates all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba and the Red Sea. Now, Solomon controlled the entire Levant, not just directly, but also indirectly because of his treaties with the Phoenicians. Remember, we've talked about that incessantly, I suppose, that Solomon created a great economic power by uniting the southern route through the Red Sea and down the Horn of Africa and even over to India at one end, and then the entire Phoenician operation, which included the whole Mediterranean basin and even further up into the Black Sea and even all the way up to the Sea of Azov, about which is, I mean, try to watch the news now without seeing the map of the Sea of Azov. If you turn on the news at all or read a paper, you're right there, with the Crimean Peninsula and all those things are in contention right now. Solomon, in fact, married the daughter of the Pharaoh, and marriage among kings in those days and queens and princes and princesses, it was always a political arrangement. It was always. They didn't get married because they found true love. True love had absolutely nothing to do with it. If the price is right, and you're going to get that particular village or that particular island or that particular roadway, and the bride and groom had absolutely nothing to say about it. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. Now Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter, Berith Karath, to cut a deal, literally, to cut a deal. Karat means to cut. Berith Karat is the normal expression used for making a treaty or a covenant. And that's the same word, for example, you have to say in Genesis 15, when God makes a covenant with Abraham. Same expression, Berith Karat. Now Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house, and the house of the Lord, and the wall all around Jerusalem. Now, notice that up to this point in the Bible, there have been several mentions of pharaohs. I think our first mention of a pharaoh is in Genesis 12, when Abraham goes down into Egypt and the pharaoh falls in love with his wife, which seems to have been a pretty big deal. It seems to me like everybody was falling in love with this 90-year-old woman. It makes you think. I mean, that's the first time we have a pharaoh mentioned. There's no name. There's no name. Up to this point in the story, no pharaoh in the Bible has been named. Isn't that interesting? No pharaoh has been named. Why is that? Why no pharaohs have been named? These are family memories. These are not official records. These are family memories. If you sort of start ascribing names to them, you're starting to get official. one of the sweetest ladies I've ever known. She was very old even when I first met her. In fact, she was nearly as old as I am now. But she was Irish, and her family had come to this country during the potato famine. She knew that. And yet when she would describe this to me, the king was always Henry VIII. And she was not aware of a problem. The potato famine during the reign of Henry VIII, she was not aware of a problem. But that was perhaps the only king of England that she had ever studied in school. And being a good Irish Catholic, Henry VIII was a bad guy. So he must have been the one who oppressed the Irish during the potato famine. It's a confusion. But as the story was handed down in her family, there was no name attached to the king. They knew very well that the royal house had been unjust to the Irish. But when she starts to put a name with it, the only bad English king, and of course they were all bad, the only one bad English king she could remember, you know. And there was no point in trying to discuss this with her. You leave them. You know that you get to a point where you don't bother discussing. Yes, whatever you say. Whatever you say. Now, in fact, it really was a Henry who oppressed the Irish, but a lot earlier than Henry VIII. It was Henry II. But Henry II oppressed everybody, and that's why they got Peter O'Toole to play him usually in the movies. I can think of two movies where Peter O'Toole plays Henry II. So up at this point, we've had many stories about pharaohs, but no pharaoh has been named. That's going to change dramatically when we get to the 22nd dynasty. Because there, the records enter into history, documented history. Up to this point, we're dealing with memories, family memories. Now, I've got the long text there from 1 Kings 4, beginning in verse 1. And I put it down in parallel beside a text from 2 Samuel 8. Both of those texts describe the administration, as we would call it, of two kings. The text in 1 Kings 4 describes the political administration of Solomon's reign. Solomon dated from 961 to 922. And I'll just go through it with you and point out some sharp differences. Main thing to notice is how much more complex the administration is under Solomon. So King Solomon was king over all Israel. All Israel, Kol Israel, means both the north and the south. And these were his officials, giving you the names of what we would call today a cabinet, the inner circle. Azariah, the son of Zadok, the priest. There's your chief priest. Elihoreph and Ahijah, the sons of Shisha, scribes. Sopherim. We'll talk about that word in a few minutes. They're Sopherim. Scribes, you could also translate that as secretaries. I'll show you why in a little bit. The Sopherim. From the verb safar, which first means to calculate, to figure, and then to write down what you figured. So it becomes the verb for writing. A book is a sefer. A sofer is a writer. That's the participial form of safar. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, the archivist. Hatmaskir, the archivist. I think the King James translated that as recorder. I think archivist is a better word. Keeps the records. Extremely important position. Sometimes people get very sensitive when they think the documents have been misplaced. You may have noticed that. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, over the army. Okay, Secretary of Defense. Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. So we have two more members of the priestly family. Azariah, the son of Nathan, over the officers. Zabud, the son of Nathan, a priest and the king's friend. I think I should not translate that as friend. That's the way it's translated, and I just left it that way. But I got to thinking after I put it down here this way, confidant. The king's confidant. He's the friend with whom he shares things. He's a priest he's the priest that the king can talk to. In other words, royal chaplain. Confidant. Ahisar over the household. Later on, that would be called cupbearer, which is an extremely important position. The rule of the royal household. And Adoniram, the son of Abda, over the labor force. And that's an extremely big position because there's a big labor force under Solomon. Compare this description of Solomon's court with the earlier one of David, his father. Starts out, David reigned over all Israel. And David administered judgment and justice to all the people. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Now remember, when Solomon takes over, one of the first men to bite the dust is Joab. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, the archivist, same expression. Mazkir. Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were the priests. Sariah was the scribe. Notice that he only has one sofer, one scribe. Solomon has two. It's become a much more important position. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, over both the Kerethites and the Pelethites. The Kerethites and the Pelethites are a mercenary force, and they're both branches of the Philistines. In fact, Philistine and Pelethite have exactly the same root, Peresh. And David's sons, and here I switch off of the Hebrew text, which I think is corrupt at this point. I go over to the Septuagint, because it says David's sons were priests in the Hebrew text. That's certainly not right. It's certainly incorrect. And I've looked up the critical edition, in the critical edition, the Stuttgart critical edition of the Hebrew text. They throw out all kinds of suggestions in the footnotes. It seems to me the best one is from the Septuagint. That's the one I use. Avlarkai, court ministers of the court. So notice that the organization of Solomon's kingdom and the government is much more complex. We observe now that Solomon employed 2 scribes or secretaries, whereas his father had been content with just one. I want to look at those 2 scribes with you. This is crucial to the theme we're having today of Solomon in Egypt. There are 2 brothers, Elihoreph and Ahijah. Now what I find most significant is it gives the name of their father, Shisha. Shisha is an Egyptian name. They're Egyptians. Got that? These two boys are Egyptians. I say boys, they may have been in their 50s for all I know. You know, they don't have when you're in your 50s, you only have a little bit of time left to give up boyhood. Now Solomon had recently married a daughter of the Pharaoh, an event sealing his political and mercantile dealings with Egypt. And these two talented men apparently came to the king's attention during the course of the negotiations. Now think about this. Egypt had been around a long time. Egypt had lots of cultured people who could read and write. People who could deal on the international stage with a great deal of savoir-faire. Israel didn't. There was no serious educational system in Israel. Egypt had schools for centuries. Egypt had produced philosophers and architects. Egyptians had built the pyramids, for crying out loud. And imagine, they built the pyramids without even a decimal system. I just still haven't figured that one out at all. How do you build a pyramid without a decimal system? You know, the Egyptians had done marvels of engineering. The Egyptians had been building temples and palaces for 1,000 years before Egypt got out of their tent, before Israel got out of their tents. It seemed to me probable that the two brothers saw in Solomon's enlightened reign in Israel a chance to make their escape were probably the meager prospects of this last king of the 21st dynasty. Solomon's got something new and going on. He's got a big mercantile arrangement, lots of opportunity for getting a move on. Nancy asked me last week, when these people moved off the farms and moved into the city, what work did they do? That was plenty of work. A booming economy produces lots of employment. And people move and move fast because money moves fast. Well, whatever the reason, Elihoreph and Ahijah came to Jerusalem to work for Solomon. Now, the dignity and prominence of the brothers' new office is implied, I believe, by their being named immediately after Zadok the priest in the list of Solomon's court officers. They're the first ones named after the high priest. Or I'm a little bit anachronistic. They're called the high priest, but the priest. Indeed, the royal scribes, the Sophirim, of ancient kingdoms, were extraordinarily important people. The smart people, the learned people, the literate people, the savvy people that kings surrounded themselves with. They were administrators of what today would be called the State Department. The overseers and instructors of diplomatic delegations. See, when you have a kingdom, you're going to have delegates to courts and so forth. The authors of treaties, judicial decisions, contracts, royal decrees, other instruments of legislation, all kinds of state documents, and other official papers that would eventually be handed over to the royal archivist, the maskir. Maskir must keep all of this. He's the librarian. He knows where the papers are at all times. The royal archivist would preserve all of this material because it was practical. You had to have records of everything. Otherwise, you do not have continuity. Continuity is done through printed records. But these are also preserved for the instruction of future generations. Thus, much of what we know of ancient history, we ultimately owe to these men, to such men. Their hands held the stylus, the brush, the pen. lots of documents, ancient documents, passed through these men. They wrote them down. Or they chiseled them in stone. For example, Hammurabi's Code. Just chiseled in stone. If you want to see Hammurabi's Code, you'll have to go to France. Because the copy of it, the largest extant copy of it, is in the Louvre. I don't see Scott and Christie here, but I think they visited when they were there. Scott, did you say I see it?
I was in the room, I don't know where we got today.
If you were in that room, you saw it. In fact, I remember Christie telling me all these statues of pharaohs and Babylonian emperors that she saw there. When I was at the British Museum, I got in a great deal of trouble. I was rather young at the time, but that's not an excuse. I got in a great deal of trouble. I can't remember what emperor it was, but it's a great big statue. I climbed up and sat on his lap. And you know, the Brits can be so snippy. That's a true story. I can't believe I actually did that. They told me that was not customary. But anyway, Hammurabi's Code. See, there's one that's actually carved in stone. Other documents. You know you're being recorded. Okay. The laws of Eshnunna, the edict of Amusadaka, the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon, the Amarna letters, the Mari and Nutsi tablets, which are clay tablets, the archives of Tutankhamun, the Aramaic papyri of the Elementine, and scores, perhaps hundreds, of other ancient documents we owe to the hands of men like this. So this political institution, extremely important for the transmission of a culture and history and memory. The writings of such men also provided source material for historians. The historians could do research. The documents that they wrote were handled by people like Herodotus, Thucydides, Polybius, Diodor of Tarsus, Diodor of Sicily, Diogenes Laertius, Tacitus, Suetonius. We would know precious little of ancient times except for the carefully preserved records of the ancient scribes. See, it's so easy to read this, the names of these Elihorath and Ahijah, the scribes. Stop and think about that. The history that we have of Solomon's own reign is drawn from official documents that these men wrote. It was during the reign of Solomon that the stories of Saul and David were composed. They were composed from living memory and from the documents of people who produced them. When they came to work for Solomon then, Elihorath and Ahijah stepped into a noble calling, exercising at Jerusalem a position later to be held by the likes of Shebna under King Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18, Shaphan under King Josiah in 2 Kings 22, Jonathan under Judah's last king Zedekiah in Jeremiah 37. Of the literary sources used by the later authors of sacred scripture, the official transcripts of such men were surely among the most prominent. nor is it even conceivable whether without such men we would have the books of Kings, Chronicles, and Ezra. These considerations lead to another question, but speculative. Did Solomon's two scribes write any parts of the biblical text itself? Every time I give a talk and I see somebody in front of me writing everything down, well, it simply reminds me of my youth. I'll put it that way. In my youth, I wrote down everything. Now I've got file cabinets full of stuff that's written down, and it's not hard, to make the case that these two men were in some way instrumental in the writing of the Bible itself. Parts, I mean. Scholars commonly ascribe much of the two books of Samuel to the work of historians of the Solomonic court. Nor is it unreasonable to identify these historians as Elihoreff and Ahijah, or the staff that worked under them. See, not just these men making the notations, but dictating to several copies at once. If you want more than one copy. At the very least, the office held by these two men was such as to render it unthinkable that any writings from the Solomonic court would have been published without their supervision. You can't think that would happen unless these men had supervised it. The scribal work of Elihoreff and Ahijah was part of a larger official literary concern that characterized the reign of Solomon. One thing about the reign of Solomon is a reign of literacy. Literacy becomes extremely important. You don't have literacy in any society where everybody is working in the farm 16 hours a day. You don't have literacy. They do not produce literature. It is to Solomon's era that the textual historians trace much of the source material for certain parts of Holy Scripture. I don't want to go into biblical sources because I think much of what was done in biblical sources when I was a young person coming through is it's bizarre. It's just bizarre. And usually has some philosophical underpinnings which were not helpful. Nonetheless, there's no question that when the authors wrote the final versions of the Bible, that they used source material. I'm sure of that. Moreover, that same fourth chapter of 1 Kings goes on to speak of Solomon's own sapiential and literary culture. The book of Proverbs contains at least two bodies of writings under his name. The collection of Proverbs with chapters 10 and 22 and chapters 25 and 29 of Proverbs are ascribed to Solomon himself. Look what it says, for example, in the text you have there, 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 30. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and the wisdom of Egypt. What do they mean by the wisdom of the East? Arabia, chiefly, and parts further east. For he was wiser than all men, and then they give a list of philosophers that we would not otherwise know ever existed. Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Chalco, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. Remember that even the Queen of Sheba found out about it. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Is there any way we could get a hard copy of that?
I couldn't hear what it was. I know it was, sorry, I'm sure we can. archive.org. No, what was it?
No, no.
I can't hear you from where I am.
Okay, I'm sorry, Dre.
I watch the reruns.
It'll make more sense to you that way. Heaven knows I'm not making much sense right now.
May I interrupt with a question?
Yes, Darling.
Were these written on papyrus? Was that what would have been the media?
Some things were written on papyrus, but remember the papyrus itself is very frail.
Right.
We don't have very many documents left on papyri. What we mainly have would be documents on skins.
Oh.
And the more permanent would be baked into clay tablets.
Yeah, but I'm assuming that most of this,
Papyrus and paper,
yeah.
primitive forms of paper. No. But if you want a permanent document, papyrus is not really your. We only started using papyrus, for example, for the New Testament. We've only been using a papyri for about 150 years, because they're our earliest papyri of the New Testament go back in the 2nd century, whereas our first vellums, I guess you say, or vella of the New Testament come from the 4th century. Things like the Alexandrinus, the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And some of those were in the top 10s on the charts. He spoke of trees. Notice this interest in natural history. He spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He was a naturalist. Think about that, a naturalist. If you ever get to Sweden, go to the University of Uppsala. Make sure you go to the University of Uppsala if you ever get to Sweden. Because there is where it took the classification of all the animals and plants. All the explorers, in the 18th and 19th centuries were sending all their material back to Uppsala, and all those things were categorized, given the Latin names of all the species and so forth. Denise and I had exactly one day at Uppsala. We were given a tour by a very fine man by the name of Folk, who is one of the Touchstone editors. He gave us a day, but that's one of the most enjoyable days of my life, was to walk into Uppsala and look at the archives. It was fabulous. He spoke of the animals, of birds, of creeping things, and fish. Okay? He said a lot about fish. And Father Andrew spoke about fish. I think he studied some of those manuscripts for that fish sermon that he gave last night. Okay? Which I thought that very interesting, because this past Wednesday you also heard a sermon about fish. But this is a whole fishy week it was. And the men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth who had heard his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Now himself a man of letters, and the son of a poet, it's easy to picture Solomon staffing his court with men of literary talent. And we students of the Bible are the beneficiaries of that talent. To this day, when we read these marvelous accounts of David and his colorful contemporaries, it's intriguing to think that rich material coming down to us came through the hands of 2 young scribes from Egypt. Are there any questions before I move on to this next part? All right. As we're about to see, however, the age of Solomon could not last and did not last forever. As Samuel had predicted back when they established a king, the weight and cost of the monarchy would be too burdensome for the population, and some of the younger members of the population had been set free from upstairs, and they're coming here and invading the monarchy. Glory to the Father, to the Son, in the Holy Spirit, now and ever. The God who is, who was, and is to come at the end of time. Amen. 2 weeks from today, we will take the downfall of the Solomonic house.